I had just returned to my lake cabin after a long week when I saw her, Karen. Standing on my driveway, arms crossed, face flushed with righteous fury. The sun glinted off her oversized sunglasses, and somehow, she looked both furious and utterly entitled. "Morning," she barked, as if her yelling counted as a greeting. I raised an eyebrow. "Karen, what are you doing here?" "I've come to talk business," she said, voice sharp. "It's time you sold this cabin." "Cheap. The HOA board agrees your price is too high. The community deserves a chance to enjoy it." My jaw dropped. "Sold my cabin? Cheap. You want me to do what?" I asked, keeping my tone calm. Karen waved a hand like she was swatting away a fly. "You know exactly what I mean. List it now. Stop hiding behind your so-called billionaire lifestyle. The lake is meant for everyone. Not just one person. You can't hog it forever." Hog it? I had spent years building my property, maintaining it, and respecting every HOA rule, most of which she consistently ignored. But she clearly had no idea who she was dealing with. "Karen," I said, stepping closer, "you're aware this cabin sits on my land, right? That I own it outright." She smirked, confidently. "Of course. But the HOA has influence, and we can." I cut her off with a laugh. A rich, deep laugh that I could feel rattling the leaves in the trees. She froze mid-gesture, her smirk faltering. "You think your little HOA influence matters to me?" I asked, leaning on the hood of my truck. "Let me be clear. I'm not just the owner of this cabin. I'm the owner of the entire lake. Every inch of it. Your board? They have zero say over me." Karen's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. She blinked like she'd just been told the laws of physics had changed overnight. I think you're exaggerating," she stammered. "Exaggerating? Not at all. My fortune and influence allowed me to maintain, manage, and even expand the lake's facilities as I saw fit. The cabins, docks, beaches, it was all under my control." She straightened, trying to regain composure. "Well, maybe this is negotiable. Surely there's room for discussion." I shook my head slowly. "No negotiation. This cabin, this lake, it's mine. And if you think you can strong-arm me into selling it cheaply, you're in for a very rude awakening." Karen's face reddened. I could see the gears turning, schemes forming, but none of them would work. Not today. Not ever. The battle lines were drawn. Karen wanted control. I owned the power. And this showdown at my lake cabin was only beginning. Karen blinked rapidly, like she was trying to process a universe where her HOA authority meant nothing. Her voice, normally sharp and commanding, now wavered slightly. You own the entire lake." I nodded, leaning back against my truck. "Every inch. The cabins, the docks, the beaches, even the small islands. I'm the sole owner. And that includes this cabin." Her jaw dropped. She stepped closer, squinting as if trying to read a fine print she hoped didn't exist. But we all pay HOA fees. We vote on maintenance." I thought. "Fees don't give you ownership," I interrupted. "You manage what I allow, and nothing more. Your vote is advisory at best." Karen's nostrils flared. She placed her hands on her hips, trying to summon some aura of authority. "So you're saying I have no power here?" "You have influence, Karen," I said gently. "But influence is not ownership. And you are certainly not in charge of forcing anyone to sell property, least of all mine." Her lips pressed into a tight line. I could see her calculating. She was used to bending rules and intimidating people. Her confidence had always been her weapon. But she had underestimated me. Severely. Maybe the HOA can negotiate a compromise," she ventured, her voice quieter now. I mean, for the community. I shook my head. No, Karen. There's no compromise when it comes to ownership. You can suggest, you can petition, you can lobby, but nothing will make me sell this cabin cheap. And nothing will make me relinquish the lake. Her hands shook slightly as she crossed and uncrossed her arms. You're a billionaire? Owning all of this? And I've been underestimating me, I finished for her. Exactly. The air between us grew tense. Karen's face flushed red with anger and embarrassment. She had spent years leveraging HOA rules, manipulating neighbors, and asserting her so-called authority over properties she didn't even own. And now she realized all her efforts were meaningless. She opened her mouth, then shut it again, searching desperately for a comeback. Well, maybe we can still find a middle ground, she muttered, her words faltering. There is no middle ground, I said firmly. This cabin is mine, this lake is mine, and I decide what happens here. If you try to coerce me, you'll regret it. Karen's eyes narrowed. The gears in her head were clearly turning, her mind racing for a strategy, any leverage, any loophole she could exploit. But I had already anticipated every move. This wasn't just my property, it was my domain. And Karen was about to learn the hard way that you never challenge someone who owns the lake. Her phone buzzed, and she glanced at it nervously. Whatever message she received only deepened her frown. All right, she said finally, taking a step back. You may have won this round. I smiled, knowing the round was over, but the showdown had only just begun. Karen lingered on my driveway, shifting her weight from foot to foot, as if pacing could somehow rewrite the reality she refused to accept. Her usually confident demeanor had faltered, leaving behind a jittery uncertainty I had never seen before. This was a Karen who had finally realized she had met her match. You're bluffing, she finally said, voice low and defensive. There's no way one person could own this entire lake. It's impossible. The HOA would have stopped you. I shook my head, leaning against the truck. Not impossible. Just overlooked. I've kept records, deeds, and ownership papers in perfect order. The HOA can recommend rules, and they can vote on maintenance, but they can't dictate sales or ownership of property I legally own. Karen's jaw tightened, and she pulled out a small notebook from her purse. She flipped through pages, likely reciting bylaws she thought gave her power. I have documentation, she said. I have precedent. There are other lake owners' communities that have forced sales in similar cases. Surely. I interrupted, calmly. Other communities don't matter. This is my lake. My rules. You can't intimidate me or threaten me into selling. You've underestimated me for years, Karen, and that stops today. Her face paled slightly, though she tried to mask it with a tight-lipped scowl. She took a step closer, pointing her finger at me. You think your money gives you all the power? Power doesn't work that way. People vote. Rules apply. I am the HOA. I have authority. I laughed, a low, confident sound that made her freeze mid-gesture. Authority without ownership is nothing. You've spent years bullying neighbors, writing complaints, and pretending your position made you untouchable. But you never owned a thing. Not the land, not the lake, and certainly not this cabin. Her eyes narrowed, and she took a deep breath, like she was trying to summon a comeback worthy of her reputation. I'll gather support. I'll call the board. You can call them all you want, I interrupted, raising a hand. I already did. The HOA president confirmed my ownership and warned the board not to interfere. Any attempt to coerce me is a violation, and trust me, legal consequences will follow. Karen's face flushed red with fury, her jaw practically quivering. For the first time, I saw hesitation creep into her movements. Her confidence, her signature weapon, had been stripped away. The lake sparkled behind me, calm, serene, and utterly under my control. I glanced over at Karen and smiled slightly. This wasn't just a victory. It was a lesson. She would learn quickly that money, power, and entitlement don't mean anything without true ownership and strategy. Karen took a shaky step back, muttering under her breath. "This isn't over," she hissed. I simply nodded. "Oh, Karen. It's over. The only thing left is for you to realize it." Karen's fury simmered visibly as she crossed her arms and planted herself firmly on my driveway. Her face was a storm of disbelief and rage, somewhere between outrage and embarrassment. Normally, she thrived on asserting control, manipulating HOA rules, and bullying neighbors into submission. Today, though, she was powerless. "You can't just own the whole lake," she sputtered. "People pay dues, they have expectations. You can't ignore the community like this." I took a slow breath and stepped closer. "Karen, I'm not ignoring the community. I've invested in the lake, maintained the cabins, docks, and beaches, and created facilities for everyone to enjoy on my terms. That's how it works. Ownership isn't about popularity, it's about legal rights." She huffed, shaking her head. "But the HOA, we decide rules. We vote. I represent the homeowners." "You represent only the homeowners who respect the rules," I said calmly. "And you've spent years trying to manipulate, intimidate, and strong-arm others. That doesn't grant you ownership, influence, or authority over my property." Her lips pressed into a tight line. She tried to summon her usual arrogance, puffing out her chest, standing as if she were leading a courtroom. "You can't scare me. I've dealt with bigger property owners than you. The HOA has never been ignored." I smirked. "You clearly don't know who I am. Bigger doesn't always mean better, Karen. Power comes from ownership and strategy, not yelling or intimidation. I own the lake. I own the cabin. Everything else is a suggestion." Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched her notebook, filled with bylaws and imagined leverage. Her confidence, that signature weapon, had evaporated. For the first time, she realized her influence was meaningless against true authority. This isn't fair," she shouted. "You're a billionaire. You have everything. You can crush the HOA at any moment." I tilted my head and smiled. "Karen, fairness isn't the point. Ownership is. Strategy is. Respecting the law is. And if you thought you could bully me into selling this cabin cheap, you've learned your lesson the hard way." Her face flushed, her nostrils flared, and she opened her mouth as if to argue, but no words came. The lake behind me glistened in the sunlight, calm and serene, while she fumed like a storm trapped on the shore. Finally, she muttered, "This isn't over." I shook my head slowly. "It is, Karen. The lake, the cabin, and my rules, everything here is mine. And any further attempts to manipulate or threaten me will be dealt with legally. Consider this your final warning." Karen turned sharply on her heel and stormed off down the driveway, muttering under her breath. She had underestimated me. She had overplayed her hand. And now, she would have to accept reality: the lake belonged to me and no HOA president would ever change that. Karen disappeared from my driveway, but the tension lingered. I knew her well enough to predict what would happen next. She wasn't the type to accept defeat gracefully. This was Karen. She'd plot, scheme, and escalate until the law or sheer exhaustion stopped her. Sure enough, by the next morning, my mailbox was stuffed with complaints. Letters from Karen, handwritten in furious scrawl, demanding explanations, refunds, and accountability. Her words were dramatic: "You are abusing your wealth. You're monopolizing the lake. I demand immediate action." I read each letter carefully. Some were attempts at legal threats, others pure theatrics. Most were laughable, but I kept them. Documentation would always win in the end. I filed them neatly into a folder labeled HOA Karen Chronicles. The neighborhood quickly caught wind. A few neighbors stopped by, curious about the commotion, asking if I'd been threatened by the HOA vice president. I smiled and explained calmly, Karen had tried to force me to sell my cabin cheap. She didn't realize I owned the entire lake. Eyes widened. Whispers spread. Her reputation was crumbling faster than her logic. By mid-morning, Karen escalated again. This time, she attempted to post flyers across the community, declaring that I was exploiting homeowners and ignoring HOA rules. I drove through the neighborhood and saw them tacked to trees, mailboxes, and fences. Her handwriting was jagged and angry, the kind that screams impulsive, desperate plotting. I photographed each one for evidence and drove to the local authorities. The sheriff's office had already heard of Karen's antics before. Harassment, intimidation, and overreach were part of her infamous record. The deputies promised swift action. Later, she tried another tactic, calling neighborhood meetings, hoping to rally support. But most residents had grown weary of her theatrics. Instead of allies, she found quiet skepticism. Some even quietly voiced their relief that I, a responsible owner, controlled the lake. By sunset, Karen had exhausted her arsenal. Flyers removed, meetings dismissed, legal threats filed but ineffective, and neighbors indifferent. She stomped home, muttering loudly, while I stood on my porch, the lake sparkling behind me, calm and serene. For the first time, Karen faced the reality she'd never imagined: her influence was meaningless against actual ownership. My cabin was safe, my lake was secure, and her attempts to coerce, manipulate, or intimidate me had utterly failed. And yet, deep down, I knew she'd be back with another scheme. Karen never stopped plotting. But this time, she would have to play by my rules. The following morning, Karen returned, but this time with a subtle shift in approach. Gone was the bluster, the shouting, and the smug confidence. Instead, she tried diplomacy, or at least what she thought was diplomacy. She parked her car across the street and approached my cabin cautiously, clipboard in hand, her voice quieter but no less insistent. I was thinking, she began, twirling her pen nervously, perhaps we can work out a compromise. Something that benefits the community and, well, you, too. I raised an eyebrow, leaning on the porch railing. Karen, we've been through this. There's no compromise on ownership. The lake is mine. The cabin is mine. The rules I set here are final. Her shoulders slumped slightly, though she tried to mask it. But, you could allow shared events, or rentals, or... I've already done that, I said calmly. I manage the lake responsibly, providing access for fishing, boating, and community events. I maintain the docks, the beaches, and the cabins. Everyone benefits but under my terms. Karen's eyes darted around, searching for allies in the neighborhood. None appeared. The few neighbors outside were shaking their heads subtly, some even smiling in quiet amusement. Karen's influence was evaporating faster than the morning mist over the lake. You don't understand the rules," she stammered. "The HOA, we regulate community property. You can't just..." "Karen," I interrupted, "ownership and regulation are not the same thing. You can recommend, suggest, and lobby, but you cannot coerce me into selling or giving away my property. That's reality. And reality doesn't negotiate." Her face turned red, hands trembling. She had spent years believing her position gave her authority over everyone else. Today, she realized it had limits, and those limits ended with me. She dropped her clipboard in frustration. This isn't fair. I've always enforced HOA rules. Why should you get to?" "Because I own the property," I said firmly. "Because I maintain it. Because I respect the lake, the environment, and the community. Unlike you, I don't abuse authority, I use it responsibly. Karen muttered under her breath, her usual fire replaced by exhaustion. She turned on her heel and marched back to her car, leaving a trail of muttered threats and frustrated sighs behind her. I watched her go, the lake shimmering peacefully in the background. The cabin was safe. The lake was secure. My ownership was undisputed. Karen's reign of intimidation had failed spectacularly. For now, the lake was quiet, calm, controlled. And as I sipped my coffee, I realized that while Karen would undoubtedly return with new schemes, she would never again underestimate the billionaire who owned the entire lake. Days passed, and Karen's defeat seemed complete, but I knew better. People like her never give up, they just plan bigger, louder, and more desperate attacks. Sure enough, by midweek, news of her next scheme began circulating. She had started contacting local media, trying to paint herself as a community savior fighting against a greedy billionaire who monopolized the lake. I chuckled quietly to myself as I read the headlines she attempted to influence: HOA member challenges wealthy owner of local lake, and community vs billionaire, the lake showdown. Predictably, she left out the parts where she illegally parked her car on my property, demanded I sell my cabin, and filed baseless complaints. Her plan seemed simple: create public outrage and pressure me into compromise. But she underestimated one critical detail: truth always wins. I had meticulously documented my ownership, permissions, and responsible management of the lake. Every dock, every cabin, every inch of shoreline was legally mine. And the media, when approached with facts, saw it clearly. Karen tried other tactics too. She visited neighbors, attempting to rally them for her cause. She pointed at my cabin, gesturing dramatically, and whispered about exploitation and unfair wealth. But her words fell on deaf ears. The neighborhood had grown weary of her antics. They remembered years of her manipulations, complaints, and petty squabbles. Karen's influence had finally dwindled. One afternoon, I watched as she tried to distribute flyers accusing me of unfair practices. I drove slowly past her, windows down, and waved at her casually. Her face drained of color when she realized I wasn't intimidated. Not by her, not by the HOA, not by the media attempts or neighbor complaints. By the weekend, she had one last desperate move. She attempted to organize a protest at the lake, hoping to gather support. But when she arrived, only 2 neighbors showed up, and even they looked reluctant. Karen ranted, waving her arms, but the audience was minimal, her voice drowned by the sounds of the lake: water lapping, birds chirping, boats sailing peacefully. For the first time, Karen stood there alone. No audience, no authority, no control. Her theatrics and schemes had failed spectacularly. The lake remained calm, my cabin untouched, my ownership intact. And Karen? She had to face the uncomfortable truth: all her power, all her influence, all her bullying, meant nothing against real authority. I smiled as I watched her sulk away, muttering to herself. This lake, this cabin, this community, my rules prevailed. And Karen, for all her noise, had no leverage left. Karen's desperation had reached new heights. After her failed protest, failed flyers, and failed media manipulation, she realized that the neighborhood had fully sided with me. Yet, she refused to disappear quietly. Instead, she tried one last tactic: legal intimidation. By Monday morning, she had filed multiple complaints, petitions, and demands with the HOA and local authorities, hoping to force an investigation into my ownership. The claims were elaborate, alleging unfair practices, monopolization of lake resources, and even environmental concerns. Her letters were long, dramatic, and full of accusations, but legally empty. I reviewed the filings calmly, sipping coffee on my porch. Each document was carefully countered by my legal team. Deeds, permits, historical records, and proof of maintenance were submitted to the authorities. Every claim she made was refuted with evidence. The HOA itself, exhausted by her antics, refused to support her. The neighbors, meanwhile, began showing solidarity. Emails, phone calls, and even casual conversations confirmed that the community trusted my management of the lake and cabins. Karen's attempts to turn public opinion against me had backfired spectacularly. That afternoon, she showed up again, storming toward my property with a stack of newly printed complaints. She was livid, waving her papers and shouting about corruption and injustice. I stepped onto the dock, overlooking the lake. Calm water reflected the sun, boats floated peacefully, and laughter from families enjoying the lake filled the air. I called out, "Karen, this lake is under my ownership. Your complaints are noted, but they will not change reality. You've exhausted your options." Her face twisted with rage. "You can't just ignore the HOA. You can't." I smiled. "I'm not ignoring it. I've responded to every claim with full documentation. The law is on my side, and the community supports me. You have no leverage left." Her shoulders slumped as she realized the futility of her efforts. The lake remained under my control. My cabin remained my sanctuary. Every scheme she attempted had failed. Finally, she muttered, "This isn't over, but I'll be back." I shook my head, though inwardly I knew she would return with small, futile attempts, but none would succeed. Ownership and strategy had won where intimidation and entitlement failed. The lake was peaceful again, and my authority was unchallenged. The sun began to set over the water, casting golden reflections on the calm surface. I took a deep breath, knowing that Karen's last battle had been lost. This was my domain, my cabin, my lake, and no HOA drama, no matter how loud, could change that. The days following Karen's last attempt were quiet, almost surreal. The lake shimmered peacefully under the morning sun, birds chirped from the trees, and the cabins and docks gleamed with the care I had invested. For the first time in weeks, the chaos that Karen brought seemed like a distant memory. I sat on the porch, sipping coffee, reflecting on the ordeal. Karen had tried every tactic in her arsenal: intimidation, threats, media manipulation, public protests, flyers, and endless HOA complaints. Every time, her schemes had failed because she lacked the one thing that mattered: true authority and ownership. She could bully, manipulate, and control perception, but she could never own what wasn't hers. Word spread through the neighborhood about Karen's failures. Neighbors whispered, some with amusement, some with relief. Many had grown weary of her endless complaints and authoritarian attitude. Now they understood that the lake and the cabin were managed responsibly by someone who cared about the property, the environment, and the community as a whole. Karen herself had been noticeably absent for several days. I suspected she was plotting quietly, perhaps thinking up her next scheme, but her usual confidence had been replaced by hesitation. The previous attempts had proven fruitless. The HOA, the neighbors, and even local authorities had all sided with the facts, not her drama. The final straw came one morning when the HOA president called me personally. "We've had enough of Karen's antics," he said firmly. "We've clarified your ownership, confirmed your authority, and we've instructed the board to ignore any further harassment. She has no leverage here." I smiled, feeling the weight of months of chaos lift. The lake was secure. The cabin was mine. Karen's reign of intimidation was over, at least for now. I walked down to the dock, watching a few neighbors enjoy a sunny afternoon. Children laughed as they jumped into the water, families paddled in canoes, and the cabins buzzed with life. Everything functioned smoothly, peacefully, under my guidance. Ownership was more than wealth, it was responsibility, and today that responsibility had been honored. Later that evening, I saw Karen's car slowly drive by the lake. She stared at the water, probably realizing yet again that her plans had failed. I waved casually from my porch. Her glare was sharp, but powerless. There was nothing she could do. As the sun set, casting golden reflections across the water, I felt a profound satisfaction. The lake, the cabin, and the community were safe. Karen's attempts to control, intimidate, and coerce had been neutralized. Ownership, strategy, and patience had won where entitlement and arrogance failed. For now, peace reigned over the lake, and the billionaire owner smiled quietly, knowing his sanctuary was secure. Karen had learned the hard way: some battles, no matter how loudly fought, are lost before they even begin.